Gwendy's final task is like the Spider-Man No Way Home of Stephen King books. It's full of gratuitous fan service that smacks of nostalgia, and there are numerous instances of characters and locations popping up that make us go, oh, I know that guy, I'm familiar with this, I remember where this is from. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it begs the question, does Gwendy's final task serve the beam? Or does it just blatantly pander to those who have done the reading? Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. Gwendy's Final Task is the most recent and, as the title implies, the last book in the Gwendy Trilogy, which is a collaborative effort between Stephen King and Richard Chizmar. Gwendy's Final Task goes places I certainly had not anticipated based on the trajectory of the first two Gwendy stories. There was a level of unpredictability about it that I appreciated, but on top of being surprising, and as I mentioned in the introduction, a culmination of many levels of the Kingverse, there was some current real-world events included in the story that I'm not entirely sure how to feel about. As this is a brand new publication, I will avoid any blatant spoilers for the story, but I will be discussing elements and themes from the story. I promise there will be no detailed information in regards to, the plot, and I will keep things as vague as possible in the interest of not ruining it for anyone who has yet to read the story. Gwendy's Final Task, a brief summary. When Gwendy Peterson was 12, a mysterious stranger named Richard Ferris gave her a mysterious box for safekeeping. It offered treats and vintage coins, but it was dangerous. Pushing any of its 7 colored buttons promised death and destruction. Years later, the button box entered Gwendy's life again. A successful novelist and a rising political star, she was once again forced to deal with the temptation that box represented. Now, evil forces seek to possess the button box, and it is up to Senator Gwendy Peterson to keep it from them at all costs. But where can you hide something from such powerful entities? In Gwendy's Final Task, horror giants Stephen King and Richard Chizmar take us on a journey from Castle Rock to another famous cursed main city, to the MF-1 space station, where Gwendy must execute a secret mission to save the world. History and background. For a more comprehensive look at how the partnership of King and Chizmar and the Gwendy Trilogy came to be, see my other 2 Gwendy videos for Gwendy's Button Box and suffice it to say, the 2 began the trilogy of stories when King allowed Chizmar to finish a story that had been relegated to the metaphorical dustbin of King's computer. Chizmar finished the story that had stalled out on King, and that story would go on to become Gwendy's Button Box. Chizmar then went on to write the sequel, Gwendy's Magic Feather, with King only contributing in an editorial role, and well, that story wasn't met with what I would consider a warm reception. So that brings us to Gwendy's Final Task, which I have to assume was initially planned as a way to bring closure to Gwendy's story, that then transformed into something much more intricately and inextricably linked to a number of previous King publications. All things serve the fandom. On February 11th, 2022, King and Chizmar uploaded a video to YouTube in which the 2 authors read excerpts from Gwendy's Final Task. Before reading the first chapter, King briefly introduces the story, and he states, quote, "Your first question is probably going to be, can I read this book without having read the first 2 in the trilogy? And the answer is absolutely," unquote. Which I'm afraid I must strongly disagree with. If a reader were to go into this story without the pretext and context that the first 2 stories establish, there would undoubtedly be a great deal of confusion and questions in the reader's mind. But not only would a reader need to have read the first two Gwendy stories to fully understand and appreciate Gwendy's final task, they'd also need to be well-versed in a number of previous King publications and stories that span literal decades of King's career. In Gwendy's final task, not only do our characters spend time in Castle Rock as they have in the first two books, but another equally notorious King setting also makes its way into the story, and not just the town, but characters and events from the town's history as well. Even more vital to the story, however, is the Even more vital to the story, however, is the Dark Tower saga tie-ins that anyone who was paying attention to the cover art likely saw coming before even opening the book. Well, anyone with a knowledge of King's Dark Tower saga, anyway. Anyone who reads Gwendy's final task without having a working knowledge of the massive Dark Tower collection of novels would likely be in the dark a great deal of the time. Or at the very least will miss out on the details provided that allow for a full appreciation of the story. All of this is to say, I get it. I do, as someone who is very familiar with all of King's books. I enjoy it to some extent when these Easter eggs, or in this case, obvious allusions and inclusions, are added on occasion to give the reader a light bulb moment, but I don't know that it made a great deal of sense to go all in on tying the final Gwendy story so explicitly with the Dark Tower saga, when the previous two stories seemingly had nothing to do with the Dark Tower whatsoever. And I know, any constant reader worth their salt will tell you, all things serve the beam, so we do say, and we all say thank you. But does it have to? This late in the Gwendy game, did it make sense to go so hard in the direction of the tower? It feels like more of a means of isolating and ostracizing new King and Chizmar readers, and a baptism by fire rather than an effective strategy of indoctrinating them into the intricacies of King's prolific biography. But bibliography, that's the word. Fictionalization of tragedy revisited. In my video for the Apt Pupil novella, I discussed the morality of using actual tragic events from the not-so-distant past and adapting them for the purpose of fiction and entertainment. I wondered how it must feel for someone who survived the Holocaust and the Nazi occupation of Europe to read a story like Apt Pupil, and what it must be like to see their trauma exploited for a story. And unfortunately, I don't have to wonder how it feels anymore. When Gwendy's final task opens, it is the year 2026. We are immediately confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic in the second sentence of the book. There are references to masks and vaccines and how the pandemic has never really ended, and well, I guess as someone who turns to fiction for a means of escape and to some extent distraction, I didn't appreciate having this ongoing global catastrophe thrown in my face right out of the gate. And that's not where the fictionalization of the very real pandemic ends. It gets worse, in my opinion, much worse. The pandemic becomes a plot device that easily could have been exchanged with some far less extreme circumstance while retaining the overall point. It didn't need to be here, and the omission likely would have spared a lot of readers from having to be abruptly and unnecessarily reminded of their fresh heartache. Maybe it's just me being overly empathetic, but I feel bad for anyone who lost a loved one to COVID and went into this book looking for a reprieve from that harsh reality. To be clear, I'm not saying my experience during the pandemic is at all comparable to that of a Holocaust survivor, but as we approached the 6 millionth worldwide COVID death, it felt, I don't know, tone deaf perhaps, or maybe just insensitive on the part of King and Chizmar to include this stuff. I'm fortunate to be able to say no one in my small circle has lost their life to COVID, but I know so many who have endured that difficult experience recently, and more people experience it every day, with nearly 3,000 people dying every day in the United States alone. And if I were one of those folks who lost someone to COVID and picked up this book, I would have immediately been even more turned off by the inclusion of COVID in this book than I already was. Final thoughts. I don't know. I can't say I didn't mostly enjoy Gwendy's final task. Sure, there is what I might consider fan service and pandering to King stans, but it's not ineffective, assuming the reader is familiar with the myriad of referenced King content that makes an appearance in the story. I could have done without the COVID stuff too, though. This is when people say too soon, unironically, yeah, too soon, guys. Too soon. All right, next week I'll be bouncing back to the Pet Cemetery series with the second video in the series, which will be discussing the 1989 feature-length film adaptation. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so put your back into it and hit the subscriber bell so you get notifications, okay? Goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.